7. He had intended to go straight to the hotel to drop off Dodge's things, but Zula waved him off via text message, letting him know that they were going to be busy with the transfer for a couple of hours. Then she added another message, "See you at Richards in a couple hours." So, no vent farm for Dodge. He was going to die in his own bed. He pulled over into a legit parking space and texted Stan. "Can Elle get a court order? Is that a real thing?" Then he dialed Ben Compton's number. Of the game programmers who had defected from Corporation 9592 to the Waterhouse Brain Sciences Institute, Ben had been the first to go, and the ringleader. Later, some of them had drifted back to the world of conventional game programming, but Ben had stuck around. C+. Ben's voice was flat. He had, of course, heard the news. His voice was coming out of the car's sound system, Bluetooth to the phone. "Ben, you know about it?" "Yeah. Of all the fucking horrible things. I don't know what to say. Almost didn't come into work today." "Maybe it's good you did." "Anything I can do to help?" "Reserve a conference room in half an hour?" "We'll attempt. Food?" "Sure, I just had a really unsatisfactory lunch." "What'd you have?" "Half of a beer." "That doesn't sound so bad, except for the half part." "It was more the company I was keeping." "Lawyers?" On cue, Corvallis's phone began vibrating down in the cup holder. He glanced at it. Stan was calling from his work number. "Gotta take this. See you in a few." He tapped the screen and switched over to Stan. Then he pulled out into a gap in traffic and began heading north toward downtown. "You took Elle's call," Stan said. "I'd rather you hadn't." "Hell, I sat across the table from him." "What?" "No shit. While we were talking in the hotel, he flew up from San Rafael, with his security detail in tow." "Jesus. And threatened to get a court order?" "Yeah. Is that even possible legally?" "It's rare enough that I'll need to do some research," Stan said, "but in principle, yeah. If the family is about to take some step that directly violates the health care directive, then the Attorney General can take an interest in it, go to a judge, get a court order. And then? And then, if the family or the doctors violate the court order, they're in contempt of court. So that is definitely a club he can wave over Zula and Alice. But I find it shocking he would even consider it. He's protecting his brand, he says. Fine way to do it. The organization known to Alice as the Weird Cyberbank had bought a great big old building from an old-school, non-weird, non-cyber bank that, around the turn of the millennium, had gone belly up in a financial downturn and pursuant imbroglio. During the 1930s, this building had probably been considered tall and futuristic. Now it was medium-sized and retro-quaint. The new owners had done all of the structural upgrades needed to keep it from collapsing into a huge mound of bricks during the next earthquake, and then they had parceled it out into chunks for use by various of their sub-entities. The Weird Cyberbank per se, the for-profit financial institution that had been spawned out of an earlier startup called Epiphyte and been joined by diverse, more or less murky co-conspirators, occupied the upper two-thirds of the building. The lower floors were for the Waterhouse Shafto Family Foundation and its offshoot, WOPSI. It was on a steep downtown slope. On the downhill side you walked into the first floor, but on the uphill side the pedestrian entrance was on the fourth story. In between was a wedge of space that was difficult for spatially challenged visitors, and so the architects had made the probably wise decision to leave it mostly deconstructed, exposing all the massive new structural steelwork that was now knitting together the gingerbready brick and marble confection on top of it. There was security, befitting a bank with supposed connections to all kinds of mysterious and maybe nefarious clients. But the internal partitions were mostly glass, and so you could at least see all of the places you weren't being allowed to go. It was out of the question that Corvallis Kawasaki would just stroll in on short notice and sign the boilerplate NDA that the security guard would present to him. Therefore it went without saying that he was going to be issued a mere sticker, not a badge, and that he'd have to be accompanied by Ben at all times. They'd be restricted to visitor-friendly zones on the building's lower levels. There were a few meeting rooms for just such occasions, but a glance through their glass walls proved that those were all spoken for at the moment. Therefore Ben and C+, having nowhere else to go, began to wander through a permanent museum exhibit that occupied the interior of the first 3 stories. This looked expensive. It had not just been thrown together by interns. One sensed that serious people had come over from London and worked on it for years. It was intended to be here for a long time. Wordy plaques, etched in mysterious corrosion-proof metal, explained deep background that struck C+ as very interesting. He'd have to come back later and actually read them. But the quick visual takeaway, absorbed by some background process in his brain as he ambled around and made small talk with Ben, was that the deep history of this institution reached all the way back to some era of history where men wore large periwigs, not the white-powdered George Washington kind, but normal hair colors, and that there were connections on the math and science side to Pascal and Leibniz, and on the money side to an old banking dynasty called the Heckelhebers, and politically to— could that really be Peter the Great? Somehow that had come together in an institution called the Leibniz Archiv in Hanover, which frankly hadn't done a heck of a lot for a few hundred years. The designers of this exhibit had cleverly filled in that awkward gap with some material about early mechanical computers, including a working replica of Babbage's difference engine, built in a fit of nerd energy and later contributed to this museum by a different local tech magnate. There was the obligatory shrine to Ada Lovelace, and then a fast-forward to the mid-20th century and a black-and-white photo of the young Alan Turing, Lawrence Pritchard Waterhouse, and Rudolf von Heckelheber on a bicycling expedition. This was where C+ began to feel he was losing the thread, since the last mention of any Heckelhebers he'd seen was from 250 years earlier. But apparently this Rudolph was one of those hyper-privileged white guys who actually turned out to have legit mathematical talent. Anyway, it kicked off a whole wing of the exhibit, featuring an offbeat mix of stuff C+ had seen in 20 other museums. Enigma machine, photograph of Turing bomb, with unique exhibits such as a computer that Lawrence Pritchard Waterhouse had apparently made out of organ pipes and mercury-filled U-tubes. There was a big map of the world festooned with swooping trails of LEDs and flat-panel monitors, trying to convey some elaborate chain of events in which the contents of the Leibniz Archiv had been removed from Hanover, either to keep these priceless relics safe from Allied bombing raids, or because Goering wanted to melt it all down and somehow made their way via U-boat to the Philippines, only to be sunk and later recovered by Waterhouses and Shaftos. The point being that the hoard consisted of gold plates with holes punched in them, like an early version of IBM punch cards, and they were meant to be used in a mechanical computer called the Logic Mill. The Logic Mill had been much talked about by various savants since the era of Oliver Cromwell, but had never really been constructed and made to work properly until Randy Waterhouse, one of the founders of the weird cyberbank, had plowed some of his windfall into actually building a working replica. This had taken more than a decade because, to make a long story short, the 18th century design made very little sense on a mechanical engineering level and required a lot of humans to move things around. And yet they had made it work using the actual original plates from the Leibniz Archiv. And it was this detail that finally afforded Ben and C+ a bit of privacy in which to have a real conversation. For an inner layer of even higher security surrounded the chamber housing the Logic Mill. Casual museum strollers could view it at a distance through a heavy glass window, but if you actually wanted to go in and see the thing working, you had to check your bag and your coat and go through a metal detector and a pat-down. And that was enough of a barrier that most visitors were content to just look at it through the glass. Ben and Corvallis, however, went through and found themselves alone in a sunken vault. They sealed it up at night, with a contraption that slowly but inexorably shuffled gold plates around and probed them with metal pins. "It's on the internet," Ben said, indicating a flat panel screen suspended on a jointed arm. Lines of text were marching up it so slowly that the display appeared to be frozen most of the time. Corvallis recognized them as low-level internet codes. "Of course it is," he said numbly. In their retirement, some of the OG epiphyte geeks figured out how to program the logic mill to speak TCP and gave it its own IP address. You can ping it if you have a lot of time on your hands. They stood there for a minute or two, watching the logic mill work, deriving a kind of calm satisfaction from the way the metal prods engaged the cards. When it seemed the time was right, C+ said, "So, Elmo Shepard." "El's a true believer," Ben replied. Ben was in a t-shirt, swag from an early release of T-Rain, well worn in, with a dime-sized moth hole above his right nipple. Corvallis did not have to ask to understand that Ben had made a conscious choice to put it on this morning as a way of remembering Richard Forthrast, who'd given Ben his first job after Ben had been thrown out of Princeton. Ben had a round face, curly brown hair, hadn't shaved in a while. "You've met El?" "Sat in on a bunch of meetings with him." "Why?" "A couple of years ago he's hanging around here, trying to make something happen between us and ELSH. Once it got past the flirting stage, the powers that be here at WAPC realized they needed a programmer in the room, just to make sense of what he was proposing." "That surprises me a little," Corvallis said. "I thought El was all about stuff like ion beam scanning, the connectome, how to collect the data, how to store it in the cloud." "Stuff that's not my department, you mean?" "Exactly." "Well, he's looking beyond that," Ben said, and took a swig of his flat white. "In a way, that's the part of it he's least comfortable with, right?" "Because he's a bit basher?" "Yeah. He had to stretch quite a bit to get his head around the biology." "That's kind of reflected in his whole basic approach, come to think of it," Corvallis said. "I know, right? The Afraid of Cryonics guys were all about physical preservation of the body, bringing that particular piece of meat back to life." Ben waved his hand, pantomiming El Shepard trying to wave that idea into oblivion. "Not El's thing at all, no. Turn it into bits, as soon as possible. Throw the meat away." He gestured emphatically toward the logic mill, a wild look on his face, mocking the kind of person who would look at such a machine and say, "Now there's a proper brain." And then simulate that brain digitally. "Yes. You know he's a singularity guy." "Yeah, I knew that about El." "So it all fits together," Ben said. He was grinning, without a great deal of humor behind it. "And he wanted to partner up with you guys on that aspect of it. What to do next, in other words. The recreation of a brain's functioning in software. Reincarnating a scanned connectome as a digital soul, living in the cloud." "I signed an NDA, so I can't say much," Ben said. "But I already told you I was in the meetings. You can put two and two together." "Nothing came of it." "Ah," Ben scoffed. "Elmo tried to hire me, though, after it all failed to materialize." "But you didn't," Corvallis began. Ben cut him off with a gesture that he recognized from many a meeting at Corporation 9592, both hands out, palms facing toward the floor, skating rapidly back and forth, as if scrubbing a bad idea off of an imaginary whiteboard. "See, no, hear my words. He's fucking crazy. To me he seems sane, but just, I don't know, excessively literal-minded about what he believes. Same diff. It's his religion, man, and he uses it like all the worst religious people. As an excuse to just do what he wants, you mean?" "Yeah. I got that about him." "He's going to fail," Ben said. "You sound pretty sure of that." "It's because of Dodge." "I don't follow." "That's how I know, see. That's how I can tell if any company is going to succeed or fail. It comes down to leadership. At 9592, we had a great leader in Richard Forthrast. Here we've got that too in the Waterhouse clan. Oh, they couldn't be more different from Dodge, but they are fine leaders in their own way. El is not a great leader. So it doesn't matter how much money he has, how smart his people are. It just doesn't fucking matter." Corvallis nodded. They sat there for a few moments in silence, watching the logic mill think. Vin said, "Don't let the son of a bitch have Dodge's brain," would be my takeaway.